They drove her out before the church bell finished ringing. Like the sound itself didn't want to witness it, and by the time the dust settled behind her boots, no one in that town could say they hadn't chosen silence over truth. Ayanna didn't look back. Not at the wooden buildings, not at the faces that had watched her walk past with that quiet kind of judgment that didn't need words. She just kept moving down the long stretch of road where the earth cracked under the sun and the wind carried. Nothing but dry heat and memory. Her dress brushed against her ankles with each step. Worn thin from miles she hadn't planned to walk, and the small leather cord at her neck tapped softly against her collarbone, a rhythm that felt steadier than her breath. Behind her, the gates of the town creaked shut, slow and final, like a decision no one intended to undo. She adjusted the bundle in her arms. Light enough to carry, but heavy in the way only certain things could be, and kept walking as the horizon shimmered ahead, endless and indifferent. The first sound came after maybe half a mile, faint at first, like a thought she tried to ignore, then clearer, the measured rhythm of hooves pressing into dry ground. Not rushing, not chasing, just there. She slowed without meaning to, her hand drifting near the knife at her side, fingers hovering, waiting for the sound to pass or reveal itself. But it didn't pass. It matched her. Step for step, breath for breath. She stopped, and the sound stopped. She turned slightly, just enough to catch the edge of a shadow stretching across the road beside hers. The cowboy sat tall in the saddle, hat pulled low against the sun, his horse still as carved wood, the leather of the reins creaking softly in his grip. He didn't speak, didn't reach for anything, didn't even shift his weight. He just waited, like whatever brought him here wasn't in a hurry. "You're a long way from where you belong," she said, her voice steady, dry as the land between them. The man tipped his hat just enough to reveal eyes that didn't carry the same judgment she'd left behind. "So are you," he answered, quiet, like he wasn't trying to win anything. The wind moved between them, lifting a line of dust that blurred the distance. And for a moment, neither moved. Ayanna turned back to the road, choosing forward over questions, and started walking again. The hooves followed. Not closer, not farther, just there. "Don't follow me," she said without turning this time. "I'm not," he replied after a beat, the faintest hint of something in his voice. Not humor, not defiance, something steadier, just riding the same way. She almost laughed at that, but the sound died before it could form. The road stretched ahead in a pale ribbon, cutting through scrub and stone, and the sun pressed down hard enough to make the air ripple. Miles passed like that, the silence growing thicker, heavier, until it wasn't empty anymore, just shared. Once she stumbled, just slightly, enough that her hand brushed against her knee before she caught herself. The horse behind her shifted, a soft snort breaking the quiet, but the man said nothing, didn't offer help, didn't close the distance. He just stayed where he was, as if he understood something about space she hadn't expected him to know. She glanced back then, quick, measuring, and caught the way his hands rested loose on the reins. Not ready, not tense, just there. "Why are you still here?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. The cowboy looked past her for a moment, toward the line of hills where the road bent out of sight, then back at her. "Because some roads aren't meant to be walked alone," he said, simple, like it wasn't meant to impress. The words settled somewhere she didn't want them to, and she looked away again, focusing on the ground ahead, the way her boots pressed into dust that would forget her as soon as the wind came. Behind them, far off, something shifted on the ridge, a flicker of movement against the sky, too distant to name but close enough to feel. The cowboy saw it too, his posture changing just a fraction, not enough to alarm, just enough to notice. Ayanna's hand moved again, this time not hovering but resting against the knife, her grip tightening around something unseen. The road didn't change, the sun didn't ease, but the air between them did, carrying a tension that hadn't been there before, like the land itself was holding its breath. And still, he didn't turn back, didn't ask, didn't leave. He just rode beside her, matching her pace, choosing, with every quiet step of that horse, to stay. The ridge did not move, but the feeling of being watched settled in like heat that refused to lift, and Iona knew the difference between land that was empty and land that was waiting. She slowed just enough to listen, not with her ears, but with the quiet part of her that had learned long ago how silence could carry warnings, and behind her the steady rhythm of hooves remained unchanged, Elias neither closing the distance nor falling back, as if he understood that whatever was coming did not need to be chased to arrive. "You see them?" she asked without turning, her voice lower now, less guarded and more certain. There was a pause, just long enough to tell the truth without rushing it. "I see enough," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon where shapes began to separate from the shimmer of heat, still small, still distant, but no longer nothing. Iona's fingers tightened around the leather cord at her neck, feeling the small object resting against her skin, something smooth, worn, and heavier than it should have been for its size. And for a moment her steps faltered, not from fear, but from memory pressing in where she had tried to keep it buried. "They will not stop," she said, more to the road than to him, and the wind carried her words forward like a warning meant for someone else. Elias shifted slightly in the saddle, the leather creaking, the horse beneath him adjusting its stance as if sensing the change in air. "Most men do not," he replied, simple, not bitter, just known. The distance between the figures on the ridge began to close, not quickly, not in a rush, but with that same steady certainty that had followed her steps earlier, and Iona knew then this was not chance. This was intention catching up. She stepped off the main path, boots crunching over scattered stones as she angled toward a narrow stretch of land where the road dipped between low hills, a place where sight lines broke and the world felt smaller. Elias followed without being asked, guiding his horse alongside, but still leaving that careful space, as if he had decided long ago that forcing closeness would break something he did not yet understand. "You should turn back," she said again, though the words carried less command now and more offering. He shook his head once slow. "I have turned back before," he said. "It does not change what is ahead." She stopped then, turning fully this time, and the sun caught her eyes in a way that made them look almost gold against the dust and shadow. "You do not know what is ahead," she said, and for the first time there was something sharper beneath the calm, something that had been held back too long. Elias met her gaze without flinching, his voice even. "No," he said, "but I know what it looks like when someone is being followed for the wrong reason." The words hung between them, heavier than the heat, and for a second the world felt still, like everything was waiting to see which truth would stand. Iona studied him, not his clothes or his horse or the way he carried himself, but the spaces between his words, the things he chose not to say, and it unsettled her more than the writers. Closing in behind them, she turned away again, but this time slower, as if the decision to keep walking had become something she was aware of. The ground dipped ahead, the narrow pass drawing closer, and the air cooled just slightly as shadows stretched across the path. Behind them, the figures were clearer now, no longer shapes but men on horseback, their movement deliberate, their direction unchanged. Iona reached beneath her collar and pulled the cord free, letting the small object fall. Into her palm, a silver token no larger than a coin, etched with markings that caught the light in quiet flashes. She held it for a moment, thumb brushing over its surface, and then closed her hand around it again, as if deciding whether to reveal or to hide. Elias noticed the movement, but did not ask, his eyes flicking once to her hand and then back to the narrowing road ahead. "That is why they are here," she said finally, her voice barely above the sound of wind moving through dry grass. He did not answer right away, just nodded once, as if the shape of the story was beginning to form without needing every detail. The first echo of hooves reached them then, louder now, carried through the dip in the land, no longer distant enough to ignore. Iona stepped forward into the shadow of the pass, her shoulders straight, her pace steady, and Elias guided his horse beside her, the two of them moving into a place where the world closed in and choices became smaller, sharper. For a moment, as the light shifted and the air cooled, it felt like stepping into something that had already been decided long before either of them arrived. And still, he did not leave, not when the path narrowed, not when the sound behind them grew closer, Not when the weight of whatever she carried began to pull everything toward a point neither of them could yet see. The pass narrowed until the sky itself seemed to thin into a pale strip above them, and the sound of hooves behind no longer echoed but pressed forward, carried clean and direct through the tight space. And Iona knew there would be no more distance to buy, no more turns in the road to soften what was coming. She slowed her steps, not stopping, but letting the rhythm change just enough to feel the ground beneath her, every stone, every shift in dust, as if the land itself might offer something she had not yet seen. Beside her, Elias guided his horse with quiet precision, the animal's breath steady, its hooves careful on the uneven terrain, and there was something in the way he moved now that was different, not tense, not afraid, but aware in a way that came from having stood in places like this before. "They will reach us here," she said, her voice low, certain. Not a warning, but a fact. Elias nodded once, his gaze moving along the edges of the pass, measuring the space, the distance, the time they had left. "Then this is where we stop running," he replied, simple, as if the decision had already been made long before she spoke it. Iona stopped then, fully, turning to face him, the narrow walls of rock catching the light and holding it still around them. And for a moment the world felt smaller, contained, like everything outside this place had fallen away. "You are not part of this," she said. And this time there was no sharpness, only something quieter, something closer to truth. Elias looked at her, really looked, not at the surface, not at the dust on her clothes or the weight in her posture, but at the steadiness she carried even now. And he shook his head slightly. "That is where you are wrong," he said. "I was part of this long before I found you on that road." The words settled between them, heavier than anything he had said before, and Iona's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of something she had not expected. "What does that mean?" she asked, and there was no accusation in it, only a need to understand. What kind of man chose to stay when leaving was easier? Elias exhaled slowly, his hand resting on the saddle horn, fingers brushing against worn leather that had seen more miles than most men would admit to. "It means I have stood on the other side of this kind of moment," he said, his voice quieter now. Not hiding, just careful. "I have listened to stories that were easier to believe than the truth, and I did not question them when I should have." Iona held his gaze, searching for something in his words, and for the first time since he had appeared beside her, she saw it clearly, not regret spoken aloud, but the kind that lived in the way a man chose his next step. The sound behind them grew closer, hooves striking stone now, sharper, clearer, and the shapes of the riders began to enter the mouth of the pass, their outlines cutting against the light. Iona turned slightly, her hand opening at last to reveal the small silver token resting in her palm, its surface catching the dim light with a quiet glint, and for a moment she simply looked at it, as if deciding whether it was a shield or a burden. "This is what they want," she said, holding it out just enough for Elias to see. "Not me." He studied it without reaching, his eyes tracing the markings, the wear along its edges, and something in his expression shifted, recognition not of the object itself, but of what it represented. "Proof," he said, not as a question. She closed her fingers around it again. "Proof they do. Not want anyone to see." The riders entered the pass then, slowing as the space narrowed, their presence filling the air in a way that could not be ignored, and the distance between them and the two figures ahead shortened with each measured step. Iona took one step forward, then another, placing herself squarely in the center of the path, her shoulders straight, her chin level, not defiant, not fearful, just unmoving. Elias dismounted beside her, boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that seemed louder in the quiet, and he stepped forward until he stood just slightly ahead of her, not blocking, not claiming, just there. The riders slowed further, their horses shifting, sensing the stillness in front of them, and for a moment no one spoke, the air thick with everything that had led to this point. Iona felt the weight of the token in her hand, the years behind it, the truth it carried, and she knew this was the moment it had always been leading toward. Elias stood with his hands at his sides, not reaching for anything, not making a show of strength, only placing himself in a line that had not been there before. The first rider's voice broke the silence, sharp, carrying through the narrow space, but Elias did not answer it, did not react to the tone or the demand. He simply took one small step forward, enough to make a difference, not enough to threaten. And in that step, something shifted, not in the men behind them, not yet, but in the space between what had been assumed and what was about to be seen, as if the truth, quiet and unarmed, had finally chosen where to stand. The rider at the front did not raise his voice, did not need to, because the narrow walls of the pass carried every word clean and sharp. "Step aside," he said, his tone carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed, and the horses behind him shifted slightly, their breath visible in the cooler shade, as if even they felt the tension pressing into the ground. Elias did not move, not forward, not back, just stood with that same quiet stillness, his shadow stretching just enough to touch the edge of Iana's boots behind him. And when he spoke, it was calm, almost too calm for the moment. No, the word landed without force, without anger, but it did not bend, and for a second the space between the two men felt like it had tightened into something that could not be crossed without consequence. Iana watched from just behind him, her hand still closed around the silver token, the edges pressing in her palm, as if reminding her what this moment truly was, not about pride, not about standing ground, but about whether the truth would be allowed to exist at all. The lead rider tilted his head slightly, studying Elias in a way that suggested recognition not of the man, but of the kind of man who would choose to stand where he was standing now. "This does not concern you," he said, slower this time, as if offering a path that could still be taken. Elias let out a small breath, not a sigh, not impatience, just acknowledgement. "That is what men say when they hope no one will ask why," he replied, his eyes steady, not challenging, just present. Behind the lead rider, one of the others shifted in the saddle, the leather creaking, the sound small but sharp in the silence, and Iana could feel the moment beginning to lean, not yet breaking, but no longer balanced. She stepped forward then, just enough that her shoulder aligned with Elias's arm, not hiding behind him, not letting him carry something that belonged to her. And when she spoke, her voice cut through the air with a clarity that carried no fear. "You followed me for what I carry, not for who I am." The lead rider's gaze moved to her, and for a brief second something flickered there, not guilt, not hesitation, but calculation, the kind that weighed outcomes rather than truths. "What you carry does not belong to you," he said, each word placed carefully, as if building a version of the story he wanted the world to accept. Iana opened her hand then, slowly, letting the silver token rest in her palm where the dim light could catch its surface. The markings etched into it glinting just enough to draw the eye, and for a moment no one spoke, because the object itself seemed to shift the weight of the air. Elias glanced at it again, then at the men ahead, and something in his posture changed, not larger, not louder, just firmer, as if the line he had stepped into was now fully beneath his feet. "Then you should not have lost it," he said, his voice even, not accusing, just stating what the moment revealed. The words hung. They're simple, undeniable, and Iana felt something in her chest loosen. Not relief, not yet, but the first crack in a wall that had been built around her since the town had turned its back. The lead rider's jaw tightened just slightly, the smallest shift, but enough to show that the balance had moved, that the story he had brought with him was no longer the only one standing. "You do not understand what that is," he said, and there was something sharper now beneath the control, something that had not been there before. Elias shook his head once slow. "I understand enough," he answered. "It is not the kind of thing you chase across miles unless it can change what people believe." The wind moved through the pass then, carrying dust in a thin line between them. And for a moment the world felt suspended, like everything was waiting to see which version of truth would settle when the air cleared. Iana stepped forward one more pace, closing the distance just enough that the token in her hand was no longer hidden in shadow, and her voice, when she spoke again, did not rise, did not strain. It simply existed, clear and unshaken. This was given, not taken. The rider's eyes flicked to the token, then back to her face, and in that brief movement something shifted again, something smaller, harder to name, but present. Elias did not look at her now, did not interrupt. He simply stood, a quiet weight beside her, not leading, not following, just choosing, moment by moment, to remain. The men on horseback hesitated, not in fear, not in retreat, but in the subtle way people do when the path they expected begins to change shape beneath them. And in that hesitation, in that thin space where no one moved and no one spoke, the truth did not arrive like thunder or force. It stood quietly between them, waiting to see who would be willing to carry it forward. The silence stretched just long enough to make every breath feel louder than it should. And in that narrow pass, where even the wind seemed to hesitate, Ayanna could feel the weight of every I fixed not on her face, but on the small piece of silver resting in her open palm. The lead rider shifted slightly in his saddle, not retreating, not advancing, just adjusting to a ground that no longer felt as certain beneath him. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not softer, but more careful, like each word now had to carry more than authority. "You do not understand what you are holding," he said. And this time it was not a command, but something closer to persuasion. Ayanna did not lower her hand, did not hide the token. She simply looked at him with that same steady gaze that had carried her out of the town without looking back. "I understand enough," she replied, her voice calm, unshaken. It was given to protect, not to control. The words settled into the space between them, and Elias felt it, the shift, the way the ground beneath the moment had begun to change, not in noise or motion, but in something quieter, something harder to turn back once it had begun. He took a small step forward, not enough to close the distance, just enough to stand where the truth was now being spoken, and his presence, steady and unarmed, added weight without force. The men on horseback exchanged brief glances, small movements, the kind that spoke of uncertainty without words, and Ayanna saw it, the first crack in the certainty they had carried with them from the town. If it was given, the lead rider said slowly, his eyes narrowing just slightly. Then why did they not come for it themselves? Ayanna's fingers curled slightly around the token, not to hide it, but to feel it, to remember what it meant beyond this moment. And when she spoke, there was something deeper in her voice now, something rooted in memory, not defense, because they knew you would not listen to them. The answer did not rise, did not push, it simply existed, and in its stillness, it carried more weight than any raised voice could have. Elias glanced at her then, just for a second, and in that brief look, something passed between them. Not agreement, not surprise, but recognition, the kind that did not need explanation. The lead rider's jaw tightened again, the tension returning, but not as strong as before, not as certain. And he looked past Elias, directly at Ayanna. "You expect us to believe that," he said, but the question did not land as firmly as it might have moments ago. Ayanna stepped forward one measured step, bringing the token slightly closer into the light. And for a moment it caught the sun just right, the etched markings reflecting in a way that made them impossible to ignore. "You already do," she said quietly, and there was no challenge in it, only truth. The wind moved again through the pass, lifting a thin veil of dust between them, and for a heartbeat, everything blurred, shapes softened, edges faded, and in that brief shift, the riders no longer looked like a force, but like men standing in front of something they could not easily dismiss. Elias remained where he was, not speaking, not interrupting, understanding now that this moment did not belong to him to lead, only to stand within. Behind the lead rider, one of the others lowered his gaze slightly, not in surrender, not in agreement, but in the quiet way a man looks when something he believed begins to slip. The lead rider noticed it, just a flicker, and it sharpened his posture again, pulling his focus back to the front, back to the woman standing with nothing but a small piece of silver and a voice that refused to break. "You are asking us to walk away," he said, and this time there was no pretense in the words, no attempt to reshape them into something else. Ayanna shook her head once slow. "No," she said, "I am asking you to see what is already in front of you." The words did not push, did not demand. They simply opened a space that had not existed before. Elias felt it then, the way the moment. had shifted from confrontation into something else entirely, something quieter, something that could not be forced in either direction. The riders did not move, not forward, not back, and for the first time since they had entered the pass, they were no longer advancing, they were deciding. The sun dipped slightly, the light changing just enough to stretch the shadows across the ground, and Ayanna lowered her hand slowly, not hiding the token, but letting it rest again against her side, as if to show that it was no longer something to be fought over, but something to be understood. Elias remained beside her, his presence unchanged, steady as the ground beneath them, and in that stillness, in that quiet space where no one reached for anything, and no one raised their voice, the outcome began to form not through force, but through something far more fragile and far more difficult to deny. The lead rider looked at her one last time, then at Elias, then at the token, and in that sequence of glances, something inside the moment gave way. Not loudly, not visibly, but enough that the weight of it shifted, and though no one had yet turned their horse, though no command had been spoken, the certainty that had driven them here was no longer whole, and that alone was enough to change everything. The stillness did not break all at once. It shifted, like dust settling after a long ride, slow enough that no one could point to the exact moment it changed, but real enough that every man in that narrow pass felt it. The lead rider exhaled through his nose, a small motion, almost nothing, yet it carried the weight of a decision beginning to form, and his eyes moved once more to the silver token in Ayanna's hand, no longer with the certainty of a man claiming something, but with the hesitation of someone who understood he might be wrong. Behind him, one of the riders adjusted his reins, the leather pulling softly as his horse turned its head just slightly away from the center of the path, not leaving, not retreating, but no longer pressing forward, and that single movement spoke louder than any command. Elias noticed it without turning his head, the kind of awareness that came from years of reading what men did when they thought no one was watching, and he let his shoulders ease just a fraction, not in relief, but in recognition that the moment was no longer heading toward force, but toward something far more uncertain. Ayanna stood where she was, her hand lowering fully now, the token resting against her side, no longer raised as proof, no longer hidden as fear, simply present, as if its meaning no longer needed to be argued. The lead rider's gaze lifted from the token to her face, and when he spoke again, the edge that had been there before it softened, not gone, but changed. "If what you say is true," he began, and the words came slower now, measured, "then this should have been brought to us, not carried away." Ayanna met his eyes. Without flinching, her voice steady, grounded, "It was brought," she said. "You chose not to see it." The answer landed clean, without force, but did not leave room for easy dismissal. And for a moment the rider said nothing, his jaw tightening, not in anger, but in the quiet way a man reacts when something he believed begins to slip beyond his reach. The wind moved again through the pass, cooler now as the sun dipped lower, and it carried with it the faint scent of dry earth and distant sage, a reminder that the world beyond this moment still existed, still waited. Elias shifted his weight slightly, boots settling against the ground, and though he did not speak, his presence remained a line that had been drawn and would not be erased. One of the riders behind the lead man cleared his throat softly, the sound almost swallowed by the space, but enough to draw a glance. And in that glance there was something unspoken, a question, a doubt, a recognition that the story they had followed here was no longer holding together the way it had before. The lead rider saw it, felt it, and for the first time since they had entered the pass, his attention split, not fully on Ayanna, not fully on Elias, but on the men behind him, on the weight of what they believed and what they were beginning to question. Ayanna took a slow breath, her fingers brushing lightly against the token, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something different, not just truth, but invitation. "You came here for something you thought was taken," she said, "but nothing was taken from you." The words settled deeper than the ones before, not because they were louder, but because they reached into the space the others had left open. The rider's eyes flicked back to her, And this time, there was no immediate answer, only a pause that stretched longer than any silence before it. Elias watched him carefully, not with suspicion, but with the quiet understanding that this was the moment where a man decided who he would be when no one was forcing his hand. The horses shifted again, hooves pressing into the dirt, small sounds filling the space that had once been held by certainty, and one by one, the tension that had drawn them forward began to loosen, not completely, not all at once, but enough that it could no longer hold them in place. The lead rider straightened slightly in his saddle, his posture changing in a way that did not signal defeat, but something else, something quieter, something closer to acceptance. And when he spoke, his voice had lost the weight of command, replaced by something more human, more uncertain. If we turn back, he said, then this ends here. Ayanna nodded once, a small movement, but certain. It already has, she replied. The words did not push him, did not demand. They simply marked the truth as it stood. Elias remained still, his eyes moving briefly to the riders behind the lead man, watching as one of them lowered his gaze fully now, another shifting his horse half a step to the side, small choices, quiet ones, but each carrying the same direction. The lead rider followed those movements, saw them for what they were, and for a long second, he did not speak, did not move, as if weighing something that could not be measured in distance or time. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he eased his reins, and his horse stepped back half a pace. It was not much, not enough to call it retreat, but it was movement, and in that movement, the shape of the moment changed. The men behind him followed, not in unison, not with command, but one by one, small shifts, small steps, until the line that had once pressed forward now began to open. Ayanna did not move, did not speak. She simply watched, her hand resting at her side, the token quiet against her palm. Elias exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just enough to allow breath to move freely again. And though he did not smile, there was something in his expression that had not been there before, something steady, something resolved. The riders turned, not sharply, not dramatically, but with the quiet understanding that whatever had brought them here no longer held. And as they began to move away, the sound of hooves softened once more into distance, carried back through the pass until it faded into the same silence that had greeted them, leaving behind only the two figures standing in the narrow stretch of land, and the truth that had not needed a single shot to be heard. The sound of the riders faded slowly, not disappearing all at once, but stretching thinner with each passing second until it became part of the wind itself. And when it was finally gone, the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt earned. Ayanna stood still for a moment longer than necessary, her eyes fixed on the bend of the pass where the men had vanished, as if making sure they would not return. And only when the last echo of movement was gone did her shoulders lower, just slightly, just enough to show that something inside her had loosened. Elias remained beside her, not speaking, not stepping forward, understanding that some moments did not need to be filled with words, and that what had just happened was not something to rush past. The sun had shifted lower now, casting long shadows along the stone walls, and the air carried a cooler edge that had not been there before, brushing against the skin like a quiet reminder that time had moved forward even when everything else had seemed to stand still. Ayanna opened her hand again, looking down at the silver token resting in her palm, its surface duller now in the fading light, no longer catching the sun the way it had before. And for a moment she simply watched it, as if seeing it not as an object, but as the weight it had carried through every step of this journey. It should not have come to this, she said finally, her voice softer now. Not directed at Elias, not directed at anyone, just spoken. Elias glanced at her, then at the token, then back toward the open stretch of land beyond the pass. Most things that matter should not, he replied, his tone even, not dismissing, not correcting, just acknowledging. Ayanna closed her fingers slowly around the token, the motion deliberate, and then slipped it back beneath her collar, letting it rest against her skin once more, hidden again, but not in the same way as before. Not as something to protect from others, but as something that had already done what it needed to do. She took a step forward out of the narrowest part of the pass, where the land began to open again, the horizon stretching wider, the sky returning to its full expanse, and for a moment she paused there, at that threshold between what had been and what would come next. Elias moved with her, guiding his horse alongside, the animal stepping easily now, as if sensing that whatever tension had filled the air before had lifted, leaving only the quiet rhythm of movement behind. "You could have left," she said after a few steps, her eyes still forward, her voice steady but carrying something new beneath it. Not doubt, not accusation, but curiosity that had finally found its way through. Elias let the question settle before answering, the sound of his boots against the ground soft, measured. "I could have," he said, and then, after a brief pause, "but I have done that before." She glanced at him then, just briefly, enough to see the way his gaze stayed on the road ahead, not avoiding her, but not seeking to explain more than he needed to. And this time, she asked, "You chose differently." He nodded once. "This time, I saw where the road was leading before I reached the end of it." The words were simple, but they carried something deeper, something shaped by decisions made long before this moment. And Ayanna felt it, not in what he said, but in how he said it. They walked in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that did not press or weigh, but moved with them, steady as their steps, and the land around them seemed to breathe again, the wind moving freely through open space. The distant call of a bird breaking through the quiet like a small reminder that the world had not been holding its breath after all. The road stretched ahead, pale and endless, but no longer felt the same as it had before, no longer something to be endured alone, but something that could be shared, even if only for a while. Ayanna adjusted the bundle at her side, her grip lighter now, and as she walked, she became aware of the second set of footsteps beside her, not following, not leading, just there. "Where does your road go?" she asked after some time, the question simple, but carrying more weight than it seemed. Elias looked out toward the horizon, where the light softened into golden shadow, and for a moment he did not answer, as if considering something he had not needed to think about in a long time. "It used to go wherever there was work," he said finally. "Then wherever there was nothing to remind me of what I left behind." He paused, then added, quieter, "I am not sure anymore." Ayanna nodded slightly, not because she understood every part of what he meant, but because she understood enough. The sun dipped lower, the sky shifting colors in a slow, quiet display that painted the land in softer tones, and the shadows of the two figures stretched long across the ground, side by side, neither ahead of the other. And as they walked, neither spoke again for a while. Not because there was nothing to say, but because for the first time since she had stepped beyond the gates of that town, Ayanna did not feel the need to fill the silence, and Elias, beside her, did not feel the need to break it. The road continued, the light faded, and somewhere between one step and the next, what had begun as a chance crossing of paths became something else entirely, something quieter, something chosen, not by words, but by the simple, steady act of staying. The light continued to fade as they moved farther from the pass, the gold of the sun slipping into deeper shades that stretched across the land like a quiet promise of night. And with each step the distance between them and what had happened grew, not in miles, but in weight. Ayanna walked with a steadier rhythm now, her steps no longer carrying the same urgency, and though the road ahead remained long and uncertain, it no longer felt like something she had to outrun. Elias walked beside her, his horse trailing just behind, the reins loose in his hand, and the absence of tension in his posture made the silence between them feel different, not something waiting to be broken, but something that had already said enough. The land opened wide again, low hills rolling out toward the horizon, dotted with dry brush and the occasional twisted tree that had learned how to survive with little more than stubbornness, and the air cooled further, brushing against their skin in a way that made the day feel like it had finally loosened its grip. After a while, Ayanna slowed, her gaze drifting toward a small rise off the road, where a cluster of rocks cast long shadows that promised shelter from the wind. And without speaking, she angled her steps in that direction. Elias followed, not asking, not questioning, simply adjusting his path to match hers. And within minutes they reached the small rise, the ground there slightly higher, the view stretching out across the valley in a way that made everything seem both distant and clear at the same time. Anna set her bundle down carefully, her movements unhurried, and lowered herself onto one of the flat stones, her hands resting loosely in her lap as she looked out over the land, as if seeing it not for what it was, but for what it might become when the night settled in. Elias took a moment before sitting, tying his horse to a low branch that barely seemed strong enough but held anyway, then lowering himself onto a nearby rock, leaving space between them, the kind of space that had defined their journey from the beginning. For a while, neither spoke. The only sounds the quiet shifting of the wind and the soft movements of the horse behind them, and in that stillness, the events of the day seemed to settle into something that could finally be understood without being relived. Ayana reached up after a time, her fingers brushing the cord at her neck, and she pulled the silver token free once more, holding in her palm with a fading light caught its edges in soft, muted glints. She studied it in silence, her thumb tracing the markings as if reading something written there that no one else could see, and then, without looking at Elias, she spoke. This was never meant to be carried alone. The words were quiet, but they carried a weight that reached beyond the object itself. Elias looked at the token, then at her, his expression thoughtful, not searching for an answer, but recognizing the question beneath her words. Most things that matter are not, he said, his voice low, steady. Ayana let out a small breath, not quite a sigh, and for the first time since they had met, there was something in her posture that softened, not weakness, but the release of something she had been holding for longer than she had realized. She turned slightly, extending her hand just enough that the token rested between them, not offering it, not asking him to take it, but letting it exist in a space they now shared. Elias did not reach for it, did not need to. He simply looked at it, then at her, and nodded once, a small gesture that carried understanding without possession. The sky above them deepened into shades of blue and amber, the first hints of evening settling in, and the temperature dropped enough that the air felt sharper, cleaner, as if the day had been washed away by the coming night. Ayana closed her hand again around the token, but this time the motion felt different, less like holding on to something, more like keeping it safe within something larger than herself. She slipped it back beneath her collar and looked out across the valley once more, her eyes tracing the distant lines of the land as if mapping a path only she could see. I was going to keep walking, she said after a while, her voice thoughtful now, not guarded, until there was nowhere left to go. Elias leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his gaze following hers out into the distance. There is always somewhere left, he said, then after a brief pause added, it just does not always look like a place. She glanced at him, studying his face for a moment, the lines shaped by sun and time, and choices made along roads that likely did not offer easy answers. And for a second, something close to a smile touched her expression, faint, but real. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant earth, and the horse shifted behind them, the soft sound, grounding the moment in something simple and real. Darkness began to settle slowly, the last light clinging to the edges of the horizon before slipping away, and as the stars started to appear, one by one, the world around them seemed to quiet even further, as if acknowledging that whatever had been decided that day no longer needed to be questioned. Ayana adjusted her position on the rock, drawing her knees slightly closer, not out of discomfort, but out of a sense of rest she had not allowed herself until now. Elias remained where he was, his presence steady, not pressing, not withdrawing, simply there, as it had been since the moment he chose to ride beside her, and in that quiet stretch of land, under a sky slowly filling with stars, the road ahead remained unwritten, uncertain and wide, but no longer empty. And for the first time since she had stepped beyond the gates of that town, Ayana did not feel like she was walking towards something alone. The night settled fully around them. not all at once, but in slow layers. The last trace of color fading from the horizon until only the deep blue of open sky remained, scattered with stars that seemed close enough to touch if a man forgot how far away things truly were. And the quiet that followed was not empty. It was full in a way that made every small sound feel deliberate, the shifting of fabric, the soft breath of the horse, the faint scrape of boot against stone. Ayanna sat with her gaze lifted toward that wide stretch above, her eyes moving across the constellations as if reading something written long before either of them had taken their first step, and for a while she said nothing, letting the silence carry what words could not. Elias remained where he was, elbows resting loosely on his knees, his hat tipped back just enough to see the sky, and though he had spent years beneath open land like this, there was something different about the way the night felt now. Not lonelier, not quieter, just shared. After some time, Ayanna spoke, her voice softer than before, shaped by the stillness around them. Where I come from, the stars are not just lights, she said, her eyes still upward. They're stories that remind us who we are when the world tries to tell us something else. Elias turned his head slightly toward her, listening without interruption, the way a man does when he understands that the words being spoken are not meant to fill space, but to reveal something. That does not come easily. And what do they say tonight? He asked after a moment, his tone low, steady, not pressing, just present. Ayanna let out a quiet breath, her shoulders relaxing just enough to show that whatever she was about to say was not something she had shared often. They say that walking alone is sometimes necessary, she replied, but it is not the same as being meant to stay alone. The words settled into the air between them, carried gently by the night, and Elias nodded. Once, not because he had an answer, but because he understood the weight behind them. He looked back out toward the horizon, now only a dark line separating earth from sky. And after a pause, he spoke again. I spent a long time thinking the road was all there was, he said, his voice even, shaped by memory more than regret. Every mile felt easier than standing still in a place that reminded me of what I could not change. Ayanna lowered her gaze from the sky, turning her head slightly to study him, not intruding, not questioning, just listening in the same way he had listened to her. And now, she asked quietly, does it still feel that way? Elias considered the question, not rushing to answer, his eyes tracing the line where the land disappeared into darkness. No, he said finally. Now it feels like the road is not where you go to forget. It is where you decide what you carry with you. Ayanna watched him for a moment longer, and then nodded slowly, as if something in his words had found its place. Alongside her own, the wind shifted again, cooler now, brushing against their clothes and carrying the faint scent of night across the land, and Ayanna drew her arms in slightly, not from discomfort, but from the quiet awareness of the change. Elias noticed the movement, and without a word reached into his saddle roll, pulling free a worn blanket and setting it down beside her, not handing it to her directly, not making a gesture out of it, just placing it where it could be used. She glanced at it, then at him, and for a second something unreadable passed through her expression before she reached for it, wrapping it lightly around her shoulders, the fabric carrying the faint scent of leather and long roads. Thank you, she said, simple, unguarded, and Elias nodded once in return, the exchange small but carrying more weight than it appeared. The stars above seemed brighter now, the sky clearer, as if the world had settled into a kind of balance that did not require explanation. Ayanna leaned back slightly against the rock behind her, her eyes returning to the sky, but her posture different now, less guarded, more at ease, as if the space beside her had changed something she had not expected to change. Elias remained seated nearby, his gaze drifting between the land and the sky, the quiet stretching between them in a way that felt natural, not forced, not waiting. After a while, Ayanna spoke again, her voice softer still, almost carried away by the wind. When I left the town, I thought the road would take something from me. Elias turned his head slightly, listening. Now, she continued, I think it gave something back. He watched her for a moment, then looked out into the distance again. Sometimes it does both, he said, his voice low, steady. Takes what you thought you needed, gives what you did not know you were missing. The words lingered, and Ayana let them settle without reply, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the blanket, grounding herself in the present moment. The horse behind them shifted once more, then grew still again, and the night deepened around them, the kind of deep that did not feel heavy, but complete, and as the hours moved quietly forward, neither of them spoke much more, not because there was nothing left to say, but because for the first time, the silence itself carried everything it needed, and somewhere between the stars above and the earth beneath them, two separate roads had begun to move in the same direction, not by chance but by choice. The first light of morning did not arrive with color. It arrived with a quiet shift in the air, a subtle lifting of the darkness that made the stars begin to fade one by one. And Ayana felt it before she opened her eyes, the way the land breathed differently at dawn, the way the world seemed to pause just long enough to decide what kind of day it would become. She stirred beneath the worn blanket, her fingers brushing the fabric as if confirming it was still there, still real, and when she sat up, the horizon stretched pale and wide before her, the faintest line of gold beginning to rise where night surrendered to day. Elias was already awake, standing a few feet away with his back turned slightly, his gaze fixed on the distance, as if he had been watching the light arrive, his silhouette steady against the soft glow of early morning. His horse stood nearby, head lowered, calm in the quiet, the reins loose where he had left them. Ayana pushed herself to her feet, the ground cool beneath her boots, and for a moment she simply stood there, taking in the stillness, the kind that only existed in the space between what had passed and what had not yet begun. Elias glanced over his shoulder, catching her movement, and gave a small nod, not a greeting, not a question, just an acknowledgement that they were both still there, still on the same piece of ground, still choosing to remain. "Morning comes quick out here," he said, his voice low, shaped by the calm of the hour rather than the weight of the day before. Ayana stepped beside him, her eyes tracing the horizon as the light slowly strengthened. "It always does," she replied, and there was something in her tone that carried familiarity, not just with the land, but with the rhythm of change itself. The sun edged higher, casting longer lines of light across the valley, touching the tops of distant hills before reaching the ground where they stood. And as it did, the world seemed to take on form again. Shadows pulling back, details returning, the road ahead becoming visible once more. Ayana reached up, adjusting the cord at her neck where the silver token rested hidden beneath her clothing, and though she did not take it out, the small movement carried a quiet awareness of what it had meant, and what it no longer needed to prove. "They will not come back," she said after a moment. Not as hope, not as assumption, but as something she knew in the same way she knew the direction of the wind. Elias followed her gaze out across the land, then nodded once. "No," he said, "they already turned before they left." The words settled easily between them, not needing further explanation. Ayana looked down the road that stretched away from their resting place, a thin line cutting through the open land, leading towards something unseen, something uncertain, and for a moment she did not move, as if standing at the edge of a decision that had already been made, but not yet acted upon. Elias noticed it, the pause, the stillness in her posture, and he did not step ahead, did not urge, he simply waited, allowing the moment to belong to her. "Where will you go now?" he asked after a while, his voice steady, not pressing for an answer, just offering space. For one, Ayana did not respond immediately, her eyes still fixed on the path ahead, and when she spoke, it was slow, deliberate. "There is a place beyond those hills," she said, gesturing faintly toward the distant rise, "where people remember things differently, where the past is not something to hide, but something to carry." Elias listened, his expression thoughtful, as if mapping the direction in his mind without needing to see it on paper. "And you," she added after a moment, turning slightly toward him, "does your road still go nowhere in particular?" He considered the question, the hint of something almost like a smile touching his face before fading again. "It used to," he said, "but I think it has been trying to tell me something else for a while now." Ayana studied him for a second, then nodded, not needing him to explain further. The sun rose higher, the light growing warmer, stronger, casting their shadows behind them in long, steady lines, and with it came the quiet sense that whatever had begun the day before had not ended. It had simply changed shape. Ayanna stepped forward first, her boots pressing into the earth with a steady rhythm. Not hurried, not hesitant, just certain, and Elias followed beside her. Not a step behind, not a step ahead, but aligned in a way that no longer needed to be measured. The road stretched out before them, wide and open, carrying no promise of ease, no guarantee of what lay ahead. But it no longer felt like something that had to be faced alone. The wind picked up slightly, brushing against their clothes, carrying the scent of sun-warmed earth and distant grass, and the sound of their steps blended with it, a quiet, steady rhythm that marked the beginning of something that did not need a name. And as they walked, neither looked back toward the pass, toward the town, toward anything they had left behind, because for the first time, the direction they were moving mattered more than the distance they had already traveled. And in that forward motion, in that simple act of continuing side by side, the road itself seemed to change, not in where it led, but in what it meant to walk it. The road began to rise as the sun climbed higher, not steep enough to slow their steps, but enough to shift. The way the land stretched out before them, and with each foot they gained, the world behind them seemed to settle farther into memory, less sharp, less present, as if it belonged to a version of themselves that no longer walked this path. Ayanna moved with a steady pace, her eyes fixed ahead, not searching, not avoiding, simply following a direction she had chosen with quiet certainty. And beside her, Elias matched that rhythm without effort. His presence no longer something she measured, but something that had become part of the movement itself. The air warmed gradually, the cool edge of morning giving way to the dry heat that rolled across the open land, carrying with it the scent of dust and sun-warmed stone. And somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled high above, its shadow gliding across the ground in slow, silent arcs. After a while, Ayanna slowed slightly, her gaze shifting toward a line of hills that rose ahead, darker against the bright sky, their shapes more defined now. As the light revealed their contours, "Beyond those hills," she said, her voice calm, steady. "The land changes." Elias followed her line of sight, studying the rise of the terrain, the way the ground seemed to fold into itself beyond that point. "Changes how?" he asked, not out of doubt, but out of quiet interest. Ayanna took a breath, considering her words before speaking. "It holds memory differently," she said. "Not like the town, where things are buried or twisted, but where they are kept, the way they were meant to be." Elias nodded once, absorbing that, not questioning it, because there was something in the way she said it that made explanation unnecessary. They walked on, the distance closing slowly, the hills growing larger with each step, and as they did, the ground beneath them shifted, the soil darker, the air carrying a different weight, subtle but present. After some time, Elias spoke again, his voice low, almost thoughtful. "You said this was not meant to be carried alone." Ayanna glanced at him briefly, then back ahead. "Yes." He let a few steps pass before continuing. "Then why did you carry it that way for so long?" The question did not accuse, did not press. It simply rested between them, waiting. Ayanna's steps did not falter, but something in her expression changed, not closed, not guarded, just reflective. "Because I thought that was what strength looked like," she said, her voice quieter now, shaped by something deeper than the moment. "To hold everything without asking for help, to walk without stopping, to prove that I could." Elias listened, his gaze forward, his expression steady, and when she finished, he nodded slowly. "Most people do," he said, "until they learn that strength is not about how much you can carry, but what you choose not to carry alone." The words settled into the space between them, not heavy, not light, just true. Ayanna let them sit there, her fingers brushing lightly against the cord at her neck, not pulling the token free, but acknowledging its presence, its weight, its place. The hills loomed closer now, their shadows stretching toward the path, offering patches of shade that broke the constant press of sunlight. and as they stepped into one of those shaded stretches, the temperature shifted slightly, the air cooler, the sound of their footsteps softer, against the darker soil. Ayanna slowed again, her gaze moving across the land with a quiet awareness. And then she stopped, turning slightly to face Elias, not fully, just enough to bring him in her view. When we reach the other side, she said, things will not be the same. Elias met her eyes, his expression unchanged, not surprised, not uncertain, just present. They already are not, he replied. She studied him for a moment, then nodded once, a small acknowledgement of something that did not need to be spoken further. The wind moved gently through the hills, carrying a softer sound now, less harsh than the open plains, and the world around them seemed to shift into something quieter, more contained. Ayanna turned back to the path and stepped forward again, leading the way toward the rise, and Elias followed, his pace steady, his presence unchanged. As they climbed, the view behind them began to open, the road they had traveled stretching out in a pale line across the land. The pass now barely visible in the distance, and beyond it, the town reduced to something too small to hold meaning. Neither of them looked back for long, not because they refused to, but because there was nothing there that needed to be carried forward. The sun continued its climb, the sky clear and wide above them, and as they reached the crest of the hill, the land beyond revealed itself slowly, unfolding in a way that felt both new and familiar, as if it had been waiting for them to arrive. Ayanna paused at the top, her breath steady, her eyes taking in the view, and for a moment she stood there in silence, the wind lifting the edges of her clothing, the light catching her face in a way that made her seem both part of the land and separate from it. Elias stepped up beside her, not ahead, not behind, and together they looked out at what lay beyond, the road continuing, the horizon stretching even farther, carrying with it the quiet promise of something that could not yet be named. And in that moment, standing at the edge of what had been and what would come next, neither of them spoke because the choice to continue had already been made, not in words, not in plans, but in the simple, steady act of walking side by side into whatever waited beyond the hills. They stood at the crest longer than necessary, not because they were unsure, but because something about that view demanded stillness, as if the land beyond was not meant to be rushed into. And as the wind moved across the hills, carrying the scent of something greener, something less worn by dust and distance, Ayanna felt a shift that had nothing to do with where she stood and everything to do with what she had brought with her. She stepped forward first, her boots pressing into the slope as the path curved gently downward, leading into a valley that held more color than the one behind them, subtle at first, then clearer with every step, patches of grass where the ground had once been bare, small clusters of trees that stood not as survivors, but as something rooted. Elias followed beside her, his eyes taking in the change without comment, but his pace slowed slightly, not from caution, but from recognition that this place was not his to read the same way it was hers, Ayanna's. Posture shifted as they descended, her shoulders easing in a way that had not happened before, her gaze no longer fixed ahead in defense, but moving across the land as if reconnecting with something she had known long before the road had taken it from her. After a while, she reached up and pulled the silver token free again, holding it in her palm as the light caught it, softer now under the open sky. And for a moment she did not speak. She simply walked with it resting there, no longer hidden, no longer a burden, but something that had found its place. Elias noticed, but said nothing, understanding that whatever this moment was, it belonged to her, not to be explained, not to be questioned. They reached the base of the slope where the land leveled out, and Ayanna stopped, turning slightly as if feeling the ground beneath her in a way that went beyond what could be seen. And then she knelt, not slowly, not ceremoniously, just with a quiet certainty, placing her hand against the earth as if greeting something that had been waiting. The token rested in her other hand, catching the light one last time before she lowered it, pressing it gently into the soil, not burying it, not hiding it, just letting it rest where it belonged. Elias stood a few feet away, watching without stepping closer, his hands loose at his sides, his presence steady but respectful. And for the first time since he had chosen to follow her, he did not feel the need to stand between her and anything, because there was nothing here that needed defending. Ayanna remained there for a moment, her hand resting lightly over the token, her eyes closed, not in prayer, not in sorrow, but in something quieter, something that felt like completion. When she opened them again, the tension that had once lived behind her gaze was gone, replaced by something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself. She stood slowly, brushing the dust from her hands, and when she turned back toward Elias, there was no hesitation in her expression, no guarded distance, just a quiet clarity. "It was never mine to carry beyond this place," she said, her voice calm, certain, and Elias nodded. Not because he had known, but because he understood now. The wind moved gently through the valley, lifting strands of her hair, carrying the scent of earth and grass, and something deeper, something that spoke of time rather than distance. And for a moment they stood there without speaking, the silence no longer heavy, no longer uncertain, just complete. Ayanna looked out across the valley, her eyes tracing the lines of the land. And then she took a step forward, not back toward the road they had traveled, but deeper into this place, her movement no longer defined by leaving something behind, but by stepping into something she had chosen. Elias watched her for a second, then followed, his steps aligning with hers without thought, without question, as if the choice had already been made somewhere along the road before either of them had realized it. After a few steps, she spoke again, not turning, her voice carried lightly by the wind. "You do not have to stay." Elias let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, not at her words, but at the familiarity of them. "I know," he said, and then after a moment, "but I think I stopped having to a while ago." Ayanna slowed slightly, just enough to acknowledge the words, and though she did not look back, there was something in the way she continued walking that made the space between them feel different, not measured, not questioned, just shared. The valley opened wider ahead, the path less defined now, more a direction than a road. And as they moved forward, the world behind them seemed to fade, not erased, but no longer holding them in place. The sun rose higher, the light stronger, casting their shadows shorter now, closer to their feet, and with it came the quiet understanding that whatever had brought them together had not ended at the pass, had not ended with the riders, had not ended with the token. It had simply changed shape from something that needed to be proven into something that simply existed. And as they walked deeper into the land that held memory the way it was meant to be held, neither of them spoke again for a while, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to defend, only the quiet, steady truth that sometimes the road does not ask where you're going. It only asks whether you're willing to walk it beside someone who chose to stay. The valley did not end where the hills opened. It continued, stretching farther than the eye could follow at first glance, revealing itself slowly with each step they took. And as Ayanna walked deeper into it, the rhythm of her movement changed in a way that no longer carried the weight of leaving, but the quiet certainty of arriving. The ground beneath their boots felt different here, softer in places, holding the imprint of each step just a little longer before the wind smoothed it away, and the air carried a steadiness that did not shift with every passing thought. Elias walked beside her, his presence unchanged, but something in the way he moved had settled, as if the road that had once kept him drifting had finally given him a place to stand without needing to turn away. They passed through a stretch where the grass grew higher, brushing against their legs, whispering softly with each movement, and Ayanna slowed slightly, her hand trailing just above the tips without touching, feeling the life in it without needing to claim it. After a while, she stopped, not because the path ended, but because something within her had reached its own quiet point of stillness, and she turned to face Elias fully, the sunlight catching her eyes in a way that no longer held distance, only clarity. "This is where my road changes," she said, her voice calm, grounded, carrying no hesitation. Elias met her gaze, and for a moment he said nothing, because he understood what she meant without needing the words to explain it further. The wind moved gently between them, lifting the edge of his coat, carrying the scent of earth and grass, and something deeper, something that did not belong to one place or another, but to the act of choosing where to stand. "Then I will walk it with you," he said finally, his voice steady, not offering, not asking, simply stating what had already been decided somewhere along the miles behind them. Ayanna studied him for a moment, not testing, not questioning, but seeing him fully now, not as the man who had appeared behind her on a long road, but as the one who had stayed when leaving would have been easier. She nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried everything that needed to be said. They stood there in silence. For a few seconds longer, the kind of silence that did not press or weigh, but settled, like the final piece of something finding its place. Then Ayanna turned again, stepping forward into the valley, her pace steady, unhurried, and Elias followed beside her, not a step behind, not a step ahead, just aligned. The path ahead was not marked the way the road behind them had been. No clear line cutting through the land, only direction, only choice. And as they walked, the distance between each step felt less like something to measure and more like something to live within. The sun climbed higher, the light stronger now, warming the ground, casting their shadows short and close, no longer stretching far behind them as reminders of where they had come from. A bird lifted from the grass ahead, its wings catching the light as it rose, then disappeared into the open sky, and neither of them followed it with their eyes for long, because what mattered was not what flew away, but what remained. After a time, Ayanna spoke again, her voice softer now, not guarded, not distant, just present. "When I left that town, I thought I was losing something I could not replace." Elias glanced at her briefly, then back to the land ahead, listening. "But I was wrong," she continued, her steps steady, her gaze forward. "I was only leaving behind something that was never meant to follow me." The words carried lightly in the air, but they settled deep, and Elias nodded once, understanding not just what she said, but what it meant to say it now, here, after everything that had come before. "Out here," he said after a moment, his voice low, shaped by the quiet of the land around them. "You find out what stays, not because you hold on to it, but because it chooses not to leave." Ayanna let that sit, her fingers brushing lightly against the place where the token had once rested. Now gone, not lost, but returned, and for the first time, the absence did not feel like something missing, but something complete. The valley opened wider still, the horizon stretching without edge, and the path they walked became less about direction and more about presence. Each step a continuation of something that no longer needed to be questioned. They did not speak again for a while, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been spoken in the spaces between words, in the choices made without needing to be named. The wind moved steadily across the land. The sun held its place above, and the two figures continued forward there. Steps aligned, their pace unbroken, and somewhere in that quiet, in that open stretch of land where nothing was forced and nothing was taken, the story did not end with a final word or a grand moment. It simply settled into something steady and true, the kind of ending that does not announce itself, but remains long after the road has disappeared behind you.